Okay, welcome everybody tonight to the Band of Brothers. This is Dr. Simon Senzon. Simon has been a powerhouse within the profession for a while. PhD, basically in uh, PhD in how to study chiropractic publishing and research. It's pretty crazy stuff. I read some of his articles. What I want to basically bring everybody's attention to tonight is something called the Chiropractic Institute, which is his baby. I call it the Netflix for chiropractors. It's basically away, it's $50 a month, and you have access to a tremendous amount of information that Simon has curated and logged. Not only articles, books, but videos of people that are gone, people that we don't get to see too much. So, Simon, thank you very much for your work, and welcome to the Band of Brothers, buddy.
Oh, my pleasure. It's great to be here. Been You guys are close to my heart there in New York, and I only hear wonderful things about the Band of Brothers. Hey, Anthony, good to see you.
Simon, how are you, bud?
Excellent, excellent. Welcome. And Gary, all right, I know some faces here. All right, I'm going to share my screen with you guys. So, yeah, John asked me, I asked him what I should talk about, and he said, talk about your journey and talk about the Institute Chiropractic and how you got there. So, I thought I'd do that. I'll talk about my vision for the future of chiropractic. And, I think about it when at age 4, this amazing thing happened that changed the future of chiropractic education, really. I got my first chiropractic adjustment. Mom took me across the George Washington Bridge. We heard about Dr. Pagano and Englewood Cliffs. And twice a week, 45 minutes each way from Oceanside. And in 4 months, my whole body was transformed. They even had before and after photos of me in his book, and they did a special on him with me as a feature case study on unsolved mysteries back in the 80s. So I'll let you guys Google that one. But yeah, it goes way back, my journey with chiropractic. I had chiropractic all through high school, and then even when I went to college, I went to SUNY Brockport, and I had a chiropractor there right across the street. I lived over Unger's Deli, and chiropractor was across the street, so we were able to get our kegs. Actually, that chiropractor was something else. I can't remember his name, but he told me his grandmother owned a bar, and he was weaned on beer. So the guy went through a keg a week. Just real true story. If anyone knows the Brockport chiropractors, I'd love to find out. I don't remember the guy. But when I was at Brockport, and I bring this up because it plays into all of my chiropractic research, I did I did a history degree. So I was trained as a historian, how to write history. But I was really fortunate. I was in this special program at Brockport called the Delta College program, where you could sort of create your own courses. I was able to graduate in 3 years. I did some intensive courses. I did the bachelor's in 96 credits. And they let me just create my own classes in my final year there. So I did one class that I sort of invented. It was called The Evolution of Evolutionary Ideas. And looking back on it now, I was really studying the vitalist philosophers. And so I wrote a whole like 40-page paper on how Darwin influenced Bergson's theory of the elan vital and his creative evolution. I studied Teilhard de Chardin and his ideas of consciousness and evolution. And funny story, if those of you that know Sherman or went to Sherman, uh, Tony Duke was the legend neurology teacher at Sherman for decades. I walked into his office one day and he had a picture of Teilhard de Chardin on his desk in a little frame. And I said to him, "Oh, you got Teilhard de Chardin there." And his mouth dropped. He said, in 30 years at Sherman, no student has ever known who that is. How do you know that? And he never really liked me, I think. We had something about it, but he was something else. But yeah, Tillhard was at Sherman. He lived there for years, and my capstone paper that I wrote, and this is interesting in terms of, later I found BJ Palmer, but for the final project, you had to write sort of your own short story. So, I was hanging out with Jerry Garcia back in those days. I was really interested in consciousness and all kinds of things. And so I wrote a short story called God, the Universe, and Me. And it was an evolution of the universe from the perspective of the universe. So if you think about it in BJ Palmer terms, how he called himself we in his final years, that me, BJ and I were kind of in sync. So I got out of college, and then I ran into Donnie Epstein's students. Donnie had just moved from Belmore, and his practice, David Breitbach had just bought his practice, and my whole family started care with David. So I started care, and then I started my master's degree at Goddard College, and it was a distance program. Goddard didn't really make it through the whole pandemic thing. It was a fantastic institution. You could create your own master's thesis. You would just go to the campus twice a year, sit down with these brilliant professors from all over the country, and just talk to them about what you were passionate about, what you wanted to study. They would critique you, give you ideas, make suggestions, challenge you, and then you would have to write on your own, do all your work, and send in these packets. There was no internet really, not much email back then, so you'd have to mail your essays every 3 weeks. Anyway, it was a fascinating experience, and so I moved to California and worked on it there, and found another one of Donnie's associates out there, and I actually worked as his CA while I was finishing my thesis. So it was an interesting twist, and he had BJ Palmer on his shelf, he had DD Palmer on his shelf. And then one day he went back to New York on the same holiday as I, and he brought me into I'll skip to the next slide. Pasquale's office. He and David both dragged me to Pasquale's office, and that's when I decided, there's something to this chiropractic stuff. I'm gonna be a chiropractor. So, my roots go deep there. This was the title of my master's thesis: Super Bike Man, Plato, and the Body, Mind, Soul. Um, I was pretty way out there in the work I was doing. I did all this preliminary work in my early degrees, and then I met this philosopher at Goddard, Oscar Marti, and he said, "You've read all these things and you want to write all this philosophy, but how do you know Plato or Descartes didn't say that?" So I spent 2 years studying the classic philosophers and contemporary philosophers. It was a pretty rigorous program. And then I wrote a philosophical dialogue as my master's thesis about this superhero on a mountain bike strolling through a redwood forest, having a dialogue with a logger. And they were just, it's an interesting piece. I haven't looked at it in decades, but it was fun to create that little image for it. So then I moved on to Sherman, so I had all this background. I had just finished my degree in philosophy, and I did my prereqs out in California at Life West, but I didn't do my final prerequisite because I got a job offer at Limestone College in Gaffney, South Carolina, teaching philosophy. And I had never taught college before, I just was fresh with my degree. So I dropped out of the new college intensive prereq program with a biology credit left to take, prayed that somehow I could take it in South Carolina, drove across country with anything I could fit in my car is what I kept. I showed up for my first day at Limestone College, and I had four adult students. It was a night class, and I don't know if you've been to Gaffney, South Carolina. It's got the great big peach water tower. It's just kind of in the middle of nowhere. It's like Tom Gilardi country. He lives just up the road from there. And so I show up in this class, and the dean shows up, and he said, if there's not enough students, we're gonna have to cancel this class. And I was like, really? I just drove across the country to teach this class. So I had these four adults, and I said to them, well, if this is going to be our only philosophy class together, I'm going to give you guys some Socrates. The unexamined life is not worth living. And it turns out by the time I drove the 40 minutes back to Spartanburg to my little duplex, I had a message on my message machine from the dean saying, I don't know what you said to those people, but they stomped into my office and demanded we have this class. So I got to start teaching philosophy. So I did my prereqs. I started also. I also taught part time while I was at Sherman at University of South Carolina, another philosophy course. And these were mostly these intensive month long, like 3 nights a week courses. It was a really great experience. But I got to Sherman, so now I had this incredibly rich background, and I wasn't really familiar with the philosophy of chiropractic besides what I'd learned from my chiropractors, listening to Donnie Epstein speak, reading a little bit of BJ, a little bit of DD. I had the bigness of the fellow within. I remember asking David Koch if I could teach philosophy when I got there, and he thought that was a hilarious idea because, it wasn't something that your typical philosopher out of college understood, which I didn't really know that at the time. So I started diligently studying the philosophy of chiropractic. David Koch was our instructor, and then he became president of Sherman during that time. And one thing that really struck me, this was 1996 when I started. This was when Fritjof Capra's book had just come out on the 20th century new ideas and systems thinking, how to think of biology using complexity theory and chaos theory, and what were all the latest ideas since the 1920s. So at the time, I was reading this Fritjof Capra book, and I was reading Stevenson's text, and I noticed that there was a lot of similarities in the way that the philosophy of chiropractic was talking about living organisms and the way that these early biologists were talking. So at the time, Ralph Boone was teaching some weekend courses. It was actually for Donnie Epstein. He was teaching the science part of the basic network classes, which was basically teaching chaos theory and complexity theory. Really cool stuff. Ralph was just fascinating guy. If you don't know Ralph, he started the JVSR. He was head of research at Sherman for many years. He was a dear friend. So I asked him, I said, Ralph, I'm seeing this correlation between these two books, and I think I want to write a paper about how they're similar. And he challenged me and he said, well, Simon, you need to read all of Fritjof Capra's references to make sure he was right. And I was like, okay, this was a challenge. So on top of going to Sherman, I was finding these obscure biological theory textbooks from the 1920s, 30s, and 40s and 50s, all the way through the 70s and 80s. I was reading all of theoretical biology that I could get my hands on from the 20th century. And I sat down with David Koch and I said, David, let's do a paper on this. And it was a fascinating thing because right at that time is when Rob Sinnott produced this new CD-ROM on, it was the Green Books. He used 90s scanner technology and scanned all of the Green Books and put them on a CD-ROM with Adobe 4.0. You had to put in a special code to unlock it. So David Koch hired me as his assistant to the president. I was a student, I forget what you call it these days, but I was actually paid by Sherman College to read Green Books and to sit down with David every 2 weeks and talk about what I was learning. And then I even hired an assistant who was another student, and we started searching the CD-ROM for the term organization because Fritjof Capra had said
the way that the biologists in the 20s and 30s used organization is the way today's theoretical biologists are saying self-organization. It's the same term, self-organizing systems. So I ended up publishing this paper right around the time I graduated. Ralph published it in JVSR. He edited it. It's a pretty groundbreaking piece. And I was looking at not only ways to because what I got from Sherman was how important it is to differentiate the innate intelligence terminology. Because BJ's writings is so confusing, right? Because he talks about the innate thought flashes and all that cool spiritual stuff that I got from Pasquale and, all of that stuff. But Reggie Gold was teaching us, and Tom Gilardi and Bill Deccan and David Koch, that we need to focus on the body's ability to self-organize and don't worry about all that cool weird stuff. Let's save the subluxation, focus on the body and not get it all muddled up with confusing other stuff. So that's kind of what the paper did in a lot of ways. And then I just kept going. I graduated. I even enrolled in a PhD program for about a year and a half because I didn't have my license yet. And student loans were flowing and I wanted to keep studying. And so I published some of these papers while I was in the program because I figured I was already publishing. So instead of writing a term paper at the end of these classes, I wrote papers that I could publish. And that's when I got involved with Ken Wilber because I was introducing some of his philosophy and some of his theory and bridging these gaps between spirituality and biology and systems thinking. So Ken and I became good friends over the years. And then I started teaching. I taught for Ken and his program for a while in the master's program. I opened my practice here in Asheville. I taught in the humanities program in Asheville for about 5 or 6, maybe 7 years. I actually taught some of Wilbur's books at Asheville, which was fun. I taught in the first ACP program with Bill Deccan, and Bill asked me to teach a history of philosophy leading up to D.D. Palmer, and also the ideas of how chiropractic and systems theory are congruent. So we've recently found all those lectures from 2007, 2008, and we put them up on Tick. So we found most of them. A few of them seem to have disappeared in the Sherman Library. So I also started self-publishing at the time, and really this idea of using the CD-ROM to pull out the most relevant concepts in the green books was really fascinating to me. So that's how I started working on my first 2 books. I started looking up terms like the soul and God and spirit and tone and whatever terms I could think of. These were the very first studies using technology to mine the green books for ideas. That's how the white books really got started. And then I just kind of caught the bug at that point where I discovered that D.D. Palmer, there was this obscure thing called the Traveling Library that was D.D. Palmer's books that he carried around with him. So I was able to get a copy of that and republish it. And then, I mean, who could have guessed that, this, I just pulled this today off of the Palmer College website. When I started these ideas, I never would have imagined that Palmer would be featuring my definitive guide to the green books on their website. So it's just been an amazing journey. This book, we put it out a few years ago, and Tim and Joe wanted to do a book for collectors, for green book collectors, to be able to show them which books were real, what they might be worth, which books were printed, like what's an original D.D. Palmer book printed in 1910 versus one printed in 1966. And how can you tell the difference by looking at the binding and stuff? And I was like, guys, this is really fascinating, but only 10 people will buy the book. So how about we do a whole bunch of chapters explaining what's in all the green books, why they're cool, what's fascinating, what's philosophical about even the ones that aren't really philosophy, like chiropractic anatomy and chiropractic physiology. So we did that. I basically wrote the first 20 chapters, and then the second part of the book is their collector's guide. And I did that while I was working on the PhD, but that's a whole nother story. But part of the bug that I caught, especially teaching for the ACP program, was how important it was not only to sort of construct some new ways that we can think about philosophy and chiropractic and kind of take modern ideas in philosophy, apply it to our philosophy, and sort of move the whole discipline of philosophy and chiropractic forward. So I started publishing these really difficult papers. I put them through peer review at Journal of Chiropractic Humanities because I knew that they would give me a really hard time, and they did. Like, I don't even want to talk about it, but it was traumatic. But I had a website at the time, the philosophyofchiropractic.com, which was to sell books and to offer as many free PDFs as I could to the profession, post a blog. And then this all sort of evolved into my online learning program. I started publishing other chiropractic classics because I started realizing that like other students of D.D. Palmer's wrote books, and other students of their students wrote books, and nobody knows about any of these books today. So I started finding out which ones can I republish, and I talked to Drain's grandkids and Paul Smalley's son, and I met RJ Watkins' protege, and it just led to all these white books. I think we have about 18 of them now. We're working on a couple more. And then I started to do one more series of papers, and I wanted to do a real history of philosophy and chiropractic on the ideas. And I initially submitted this to Journal of Chiropractic Humanities. And as I said before, the editor would send off my papers to the guys in the profession that had no interest in philosophy or subluxation, and they would write me these blinded, really mean critiques, right? Because you don't know who they are, so they could say whatever they want and be not very kind. So I dealt with it. Sometimes I'd put them in a drawer for 2 months and just tell her, sorry, I'm busy, and pull it out when I was like in a good place and I could deal with these people. But one of their critiques was, where are all of our guys? Our guys were philosophers too. So they were sort of accusing me of being biased. But really, I thought about it. I was like, their guys really weren't philosophers, but there were everyone in every school in the profession had subluxation theorists, and they don't even know it, that their guys were some of the leading subluxation theorists. So I set out to create this history of subluxation theory in the profession. It turned into a 10-part series from 1897 to 1997. And the whole thing got published while I was already enrolled in the PhD program. And it's all free, it's online, it's in PubMed, and it's really like a gift to the profession. And then I figured, all right, if I'm going to take all of this work I've been doing now for 20 years to the next level, I need some real expert help. So I was looking for a PhD program where they would sort of like the European style, which is there's these things called public PhD by publication, where you could take the publications you've done already and apply them to a PhD, or even sometimes use them as a PhD. So I heard about this program in Southern Cross, and the Foundation for Vertebral Subluxation gave me a generous tuition scholarship to help me really get this started, which was a godsend. Dr. Kent and McCoy and even Tony was involved back then, and it was really helped. And what they said was, yeah, you could use your previous stuff, but you can't come into this thinking you're going to solve something, because really what I was really finding was there was a huge gap in the literature. It wasn't just straights versus mixers anymore. It was peer-reviewed papers that have been published now, and I've been reading them since I was used to sit in the library in Sherman and dig out all the old journals. So I had been reading these journal articles for 20 years, and now that I knew so much about the history, like I really understood how the ideas evolved, who the players were, and and I really started to get that so much of the literature is just wrong. They're just mistakes, there's bias, there's outright lies, and a lot of it is ignorance. And that's one of the reasons why I published those 10 papers, just to say, let's start filling in all of the mistakes in the literature. Here's the facts. People who are saying subluxation has no research, for example, here's 100 years of theory and research that you could look to, right? So I noticed there was this huge gap. So when I tried to explain this to my supervisors at Southern Cross, these were not chiropractors. These were PhD medical doctors, osteopaths, nurses, midwives, and what the way I think was so complex, and what I wanted to do was so complex. We basically had 5 supervisors get on board. Usually you have 1 or 2, but I got 5, and they needed me to have a chiropractor on board. So I asked Brian McCauley if he would do it, and he generously gave of 4 years of his life, came to every meeting, and was one of my supervisors. And the idea was, how can I objectively look at this literature, not just bring what I already think is happening? So first of all, they let me bring everything I had done into it, right? So I was able to take 25 book chapters and 20 peer review papers and put them into the appendix of the thesis. 'Cause there was a limit to your page count, your word count, excuse me, but there was no limit to the appendix. It was kind of a loophole. So my appendix was quite significant. And this is just kind of shows how some of my early work kind of led up to that. And then I made some really huge discoveries. So this is the very first visualization of the chiropractic identity literature citation network. So what you're looking at here, this is really the central model from my thesis. So you're looking at circles attached by lines, right? And it's a graph, really. Each circle represents one peer-reviewed paper, and each line represents a paper referencing another paper. So say I reference a paper that Tony wrote, there'll be a line from my paper to Tony's paper. And then so you could see some of them, they look like little flowers because they're kind of bursts of all their references, kind of like you could see the one off to the right here. And then the other ones all connect. And then so I basically had to teach myself how to do this analysis, which is a whole nother thing. But what I looked at was, what are the most influential papers in the identity literature? So this was the literature about who are we as a profession? Are we a subluxation? Are we medicine? Are we philosophical? Are we not? Any peer-reviewed papers that were having any of those kind of discussions made it into the cut. And then when you look at all their references and how they all link together, that's what you look at in this kind of diagram here. So I was able to determine which are the 31 most influential papers in this whole network of 5,280 papers. So which of the 31 papers have the most influence or cited the most, or just, they just kind of they just kind of dictate the flow of ideas. And then I looked at them and developed a whole methodology to critique them. And I used my supervisors really helped. So we developed a whole scale to look at how good was their scholarship and how biased were they. And you could see here, out of the 31 papers, 14 were critically flawed in their scholarship, meaning their arguments were just terrible. They might have had some things in the papers that are worth repeating or citing. And then 4 were fatally flawed, meaning you should never cite this paper again. Now, remember, these are the most influential papers in the network, right? So these are fatally flawed, critically flawed, 4 of them critically biased, 9 of them fatally biased. And we developed objective measures to determine this. So it wasn't just me saying you're biased, it was not only do you have to pass this whole criteria to determine whether you're biased, and then me rating it, but then my supervisors overseeing my ratings to make sure I wasn't being biased, right? So it was a levels of scientific rigor to make sure that this is really something that's true. And then I was able to develop these really cool graphs. I just figured out how to get these engineers to help me. So this one graph is really cool. So the colors in the middle, those are called communities, right? So it's like some of the papers, they all reference each other. So the ones that reference each other the most, they make up their own little community. So what I did here was I pulled out, if you think back to that last slide, there were 18 papers that were critically flawed and fatally flawed. So I pulled all of those out of the network and I made the papers that are referencing them red, the lines red, so you could see the incredible impact that these 18 papers have. And remember, these are critically flawed and fatally flawed. And here is just another example of that. So it's just crazy. And then out of the top 10, 5 of the top 10 most influential papers were all fatally biased, 2 of them fatally flawed, 3 of them critically flawed. So, I mean, basically, what I found was our peer review system in chiropractic is broken. The editors at these and the peer reviewers at these journals, and it's not all chiropractic journals. Some of these are medical journals. Some of these were biomedicine. Some of them were health journals. People who just don't know the chiropractic literature and they don't know that these arguments are flawed. And it's just an indictment on the whole profession. Really, and but not all the literature in the profession, just the identity literature. Oh, and this is another one. I wasn't even going to add this one. This one just shows the most influential authors, and the biggest one there in red, that was Pearl. And you might see Matt McCoy likes to make fun of Pearl on Facebook, and this is one of the reasons why he does, because his not only is he the most influential co-author in this whole network, but he had several papers that were fatally flawed, fatally biased, etc. So as sort of a side project, so here's just an example for you. While we were getting all the data organized and stuff, Stephen Myers, he was my incredible supervisor. Um, he passed last year, so it's just hard to even talk about. But Stephen, just brilliant guy. I was able to do this all because of him. At one point, he said to me, "You keep mentioning this Morakubo trial. What was it? What really happened there?" Because a lot of the literature talk about the Morakubo trial, and if you don't know about it, it was a trial in 1907. It was the very first legal case where chiropractic was shown to be separate and distinct from osteopathy. It had its own philosophy, its own science, its own practice. So for years, people have used it as for in the literature, and a lot of anti-subluxation people use it and in their arguments, and often they use it wrong. So he challenged me to figure out what happened. So I went back and found I think it was 190 primary sources, and I just kind of reconstructed it. They gave me the cover of the Chiropractic History Journal for this, and we basically showed that 53 journal articles, PhD theses, and book chapters all had major mistakes about this trial. And a lot of them used it to support their arguments against subluxation and against philosophy. So that's just one example of why this kind of thing is just so important. And the thesis was so powerful that they gave me the Chancellor's Award for Outstanding Thesis, which is kind of unheard of and for social science, definitely for any chiropractor in history. um, you basically your reviewers, the people who grade it, have to say this is a significant contribution to knowledge. Then your supervisor has to agree. He has to give it to the dean. Then the dean has to agree. Then the dean has to give it to the academic council for the chancellor, and they all have to agree. And then you get this medal. So at graduation, it was really cool. I happened to be the only PhD that day. So everyone else had their black hats and I had the cool purple bonnet. I sat in seat number 1. So I went first as the PhD, and then the whole room all got their masters or whatever. And then they called me up at the end and I got the chancellor's medal. It was just really cool. My son came with me and we went out to Australia. So there's me with the 2,000-page thesis. I got to hand it to Ken Wilber. I dedicated it to him, and I flew out to Denver and gave him a copy and sat there as he read it, which was really just one of the highlights of my life. He's like, "I really like what you've done with chapter 4 here." It's like, it's just so cool. And this is what I'm bringing to Tick, So John really wanted me to share Tick with you guys and just share my journey and how I got to here. So the latest incarnation of Tick has been we've had the site for years, but we just totally rebuilt it last year. We were rebuilding it during my PhD. It was all a bit too hard at once. But it's developed into this amazing new resource where there's now like 190 talks that you could sit and take, anywhere from 30 minutes to 3 or 4 hours. I'm doing these interviews now. I'm putting out one interview a month with some old timer or some researcher, where we're actually doing 2 hours of interviews over 2 sessions. And then I'm doing another series of these 30-minute interviews on just philosophy and practice with successful chiropractors. So that's just one of the cool features. We just released it as an app. So it's got a discussion board, it's got my blog. We're about to integrate it into the New Zealand Chiropractic College curriculum. So in a couple weeks, we're going to have like 150 students just all signing up at once. So I'm like upgrading servers and fixing library links and trying to make sure that everything's perfect. Um, so I think it's going to be an amazing resource for the students. I'm talking to several other schools about where we're integrating pieces of the talks and the blogs into the courses. So there's like talks with Reggie and Tom Gilardi, and I've got some old technique videos with Walton, Steve Walton, RJ Watkins, and Pierce, and we've just got so much content for years. So John suggested that we share this with you guys and make a nice offer, which I thought would be a great way to just kind of jumpstart the brothers on there. And we could even do a group discussion thing where you could have your own group. And there's nowhere on the internet where you have something like this. It's now like a real social network, but also a learning environment. It's just chiropractic. So
Simon, I have to tell you, like the articles on finger walking, the white books, the videos. I run the Band of Brothers, but I also have to work on myself sometimes, and it's become really such a resource. Um, some of the other stuff, like I told you about the article that you published about the difference in the original DD book and and how things were, how Crane sort of changed things. And I did that down at New Beginnings. Things like that you can ferret out. I've watched your growth, experience, and everything, all the changes you've done. Read a lot of the papers you published. I've heard you interview on Purpose so many times with Chris and Pat, and then also with Chris and Matt. Um, I got to tell you, I'm so glad you're on our side. I'm so glad you're part of our brotherhood, and the fact that you have basically cracked open a lot of the naysayers and what they've done and how they've damaged the profession, and how that you've given us a lot of ammunition to basically have a real dialogue about what is real and what is not.
I'm honored. Thank you, man. And that's why, I started Tick as, I've done this all on my own. I've, besides having the foundation support, and Donnie Epstein's foundation helped in some of my early papers for a few years. I started Tick as a way to give back to the profession, share everything I'm learning, and have the profession continue to fund this research, because I
Well,
feel like
to
I'm
be able
just
to be
getting
able to do this
started.
because it comes from you, so that's why you're getting it done. But to
Yeah.
be able to do this and run a full-time practice and also be a dad and everything else, you
Yeah.
must never sleep.
Yeah, I'm finally learning how to sleep, but it was years of no sleep without a doubt. Yeah, yeah.
Anybody else have something to say? If you haven't seen Tick, you should just take a look at the website, take advantage of the offer. You will not be disappointed.
Yeah. Yeah, I've got it live until the 15th, that for the Band of Brothers 2025.
Unmute
Happy.
yourselves, please.
Yeah.
Tony,
Hey,
unmute yourself.
hey, Simon, it's Gary.
Yeah.
Great stuff, brother. I tell you, I love listening to you, love reading all your stuff. This profession owes you a debt of gratitude for all the hard work you have done and all the publications you have put out there and everything you've amassed. And you're an asset, my friend. And it's not, that doesn't, it's not something that we take lightly in this group. And John, thank you for inviting Simon on. It's always great to hang with you, listen to you, and can't wait to hear more from you, my friend. I got an idea that you've just sparked that
Awesome.
I will be percolating and get back to you on.
All right. Great, man. Excellent.
I want to thank you so much for all your hard work and your contribution to humankind by giving us clarity so we have a better way to communicate it to our patients.
Yeah, my pleasure. Yeah.
And a different way of actually, there's so much information that we need to, it's a lot of food for thought.
Yeah.
So, Simon, I have a question.
Yeah.
So, with the 18 papers that were so significant and the interaction between all the other papers and the significance they utilized from those papers that were fatally flawed, what conclusion did you come up with the literature that we did had in regards to not just the philosophical foundational stuff, but how that applied to how clinically people utilize chiropractic? And did you find that the information that was in there, was there any of it scientific, basically talking about the realities of what we do as opposed to just the philosophical foundation of it? Did you find that in the papers that really had the information that was necessary, that the theory was significantly founded on strength and principles, or is it, we're pushing on something and people are magically getting better? What did you find?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I found that the amount of research, I mean, there, without a doubt, there's always research to be done, but this kind of like the operator game, you tell somebody something and it comes around to you and it's totally changed. That's what's happened in our peer review literature. So people like in the 90s would write, there's no evidence for subluxation. But when you look at the references in that paper, for example, they go back to nothing, right? There's no actual reference to it. But then other papers will reference that as proof that there's no research for subluxation. And then that becomes a very loud talking point, to the point where we now have 16 colleges and universities around the world who have signed a document saying subluxation should only be taught historically. There's no evidence for it, but they have no evidence for that statement and they don't really know it. So on that level, it's really impacting the way people are taught and what people think is true about subluxation and about philosophy when they don't even have the facts.
Right.
So there's a lot of work to do. I'm very hopeful because what I know now about like that cool diagram I showed you, I really think of that as like a living system, right? Because when you think about it, right, these are papers written by human beings, right, by living organisms. It's just our thoughts making this cool network of ideas that when new ideas come into it, like my thesis and the papers that I'll publish from it kind of changes the shape of it. And then other papers come in and cite mine. Those become the new dominant ideas, and it changes the whole dynamic of the
Well, that's how you
profession.
get your paradigm shift, that's how it occurs. And I
Exactly.
gotta thank you for the steadfast, the determination, the whatever it took to do that. I know I could not even think about reading all that literature and doing all that. That's just overwhelmingly amazing.
Yeah.
And I appreciate it for it, brother. Really much so.
Yeah.
Special comment.
Yeah. Great. It's great to be with you all. So tell the brothers that couldn't make it. I saw you guys recorded it. So is there a way for people to watch it or?
It'll be up on YouTube within the next 48 hours, sir.
Yeah, they'd be
Ah.
crazy not to.
Okay.
Simon, I want to know when you're going to publish all those diagrams as Simon Senzon's artwork.
Totally. Well, the plan is, I just recently became an official um, adjunct professional fellow of Southern Cross University.
Yeah.
So
Congratulations.
thanks. It's mainly to use the support of the university,
Yeah.
like the library and everything, and the other faculty to start publishing the papers, because the thesis is done, but
Huge.
until the papers get published in the literature, it's not really scientific. It's not like real yet. It's kind of
Yeah.
like the peer-reviewed papers are the bricks that hold up the building of science. So the PhD is great, but the papers are what has to happen next.
Yeah.
So,
It's great.
that's the goal, and we're doing it. Just
Awesome.
one paper at a time.
Simon, I have a question for you.
Thank you.
That 10-part program that you published way back in the day in JVSR, since JVSR is no longer being published, is there any chance of that 10-part paper being republished at all?
Well, no, the 10-part paper is in Chiropractic Humanities,
Oh, okay, good.
and
Okay.
and it's in PubMed, and it's free.
Okay, perfect. Thanks.
Yeah.
John, maybe you
totally.
can you guys get that?
I'll find the links for you.
Yeah. Just put in Simon Senzon subluxation, and it'll come up PubMed. It's pretty cool.
Awesome.
Yeah,
All
man.
right.
All right,
I
my
wanted
friend.
I wanted to say something. Hi.
Hi.
I went to one of those 16 schools that don't have a leg to stand on, and excuse me for not being totally politically correct, but I knew that they were full of shit from the very beginning. So I would ask questions in class, and two of my advisors that were close with me came to me and said, stop asking questions because the teachers can't answer the question. And I didn't actually learn what subluxation was in school. And the school that I went to that doesn't want to be called a chiropractic school anymore, they basically, they didn't teach me anything about chiropractic philosophy. And really only because I met John and met this group and started to really explore what philosophy is, started to be able to know what real chiropractic is. But it's always good to hear that, learn about research, subluxation research, but the amount of work that you did and the amount of what you had to probably stand up against, like what you said, you got comments and whatnot. That's really amazing, because I just know from patients or just people that you speak to in the public, people say, I don't believe chiropractic. And it's like, well, my response is, well, it's science. So like, what don't you exactly believe? So anyway, just wanted to thank you very much. And yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks for that. My pleasure.
Simon, before we cut off, he's kind in saying that, he won an award and stuff. But we just had another PhD go through Joel Alcantara for ICPA. And Joel told me that, great, I've got to follow this guy because that was their first exposure. They got dipped in chiropractic, and that was their first exposure. And Joel told me that they were still talking about Simon's work, and that they've never, it's like historical, the breakthrough that he's done philosophically in exposing chiropractic to the world. And I got to be honest with you, we were so excited to hear that, that it was looked at that way, that it
Yeah.
wasn't just, the philosophy of chiropractic. It was a thinker saying, look how deep this goes. You need to understand it at a much greater level. And I don't think anyone's ever done that, Simon. So, and I
Yeah.
can't wait to get the white books on the explanation of BJ stuff. So some of those
Nice.
green books that I used to go through the pages, go, yeah, man, I must be the worst chiropractor in the world because I don't understand a damn thing this guy's saying.
Yeah, he needs an interpreter. Yeah. Yeah, and one of the reasons why it's so significant, and I'm not going to go into it now, but the methods that I had to create to jump through enough hoops to say this is true. I needed to use as many methods as I could because they're going to come after me. And so I needed to like make sure that this is as solid as it can be. So other professions are going to be able to use my methods to do the same kind of thing.
Awesome.
And that's what they're all so excited about, which is going to be really fun to see.
Groundbreaking, brother. It's amazing.
Unbelievable.
Thank you so much.
All right, my friends.
Thank you,
Excellent.
guys. Simon, thank you so much. Everybody
Yeah.
have a
You all.
great night.
God bless you.
All right,
Love you,
guys.
Sam.
you.
God bless everyone.
Thank
Simon, I'll see you down at Sherman for Lyceum.
Yeah. And we'll see you on Tick. Some of
Yep, without a doubt.
you. All right,
Be
guys.
well, baby.
Take care.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
brother.
Have a good
Yeah.
night.
Good night.